Welcome to Père Lachaise, the most visited cemetery on Earth. We are standing in the 20th arrondissement of Paris, on a hillside that stretches over 110 acres of cobblestone paths, chestnut trees, and Gothic monuments. More than 3.5 million people walk through these gates every year, and the reason is simple. The dead who rest here are extraordinary. Over the next few hours, we are going to visit 50 of them. Composers, novelists, rock stars, painters, scientists, soldiers, and a few people who defy any single label. Some you will know by name. Others will be new to you, and those may be the ones you remember longest. The cemetery opened in 1804 on the orders of Napoleon, and it was named for Father François de Lachaise, a Jesuit confessor to Louis XIV who once lived on this land. At first, Parisians wanted nothing to do with it. It was too far from the center of the city, too unfashionable. So the administrators pulled a clever trick. They transferred the remains of Molière and La Fontaine here with great public ceremony, gambling that Parisians would want to be buried alongside the famous. The gamble paid off. Within a decade, there were more than 30,000 graves, and the cemetery has never looked back. Let us begin where most visitors begin, and where the crowds are thickest. In the eastern part of the cemetery in Division 6, there is a modest flat stone surrounded by metal barriers, and on most days, a knot of visitors from every corner of the world. This is the grave of Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, and one of the most magnetic frontmen in the history of rock and roll. Morrison and The Doors arrived on the music scene in 1967 with a debut album that included the 7-minute epic Light My Fire, which went to #1 in the United States that summer. It was a sound nobody had quite heard before. Ray Manzarek's swirling organ, Robbie Krieger's flamenco-tinged guitar, and Morrison's deep baritone delivering lyrics that read more like poetry than pop music. Over the next few years, The Doors released 5 more studio albums, producing songs that became anthems of their generation. Riders on the Storm, People Are Strange, Break On Through, To the Other Side. Morrison was a complicated figure, brilliant and self-destructive in roughly equal measure. He was arrested on stage in Miami in 1969 on charges of indecent exposure, an incident that dogged him legally for the rest of his short life. By 1971, exhausted by touring and trials, he moved to Paris with his girlfriend Pamela Corson, hoping to focus on his poetry. He was 27 years old. On July 3rd of that year, Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though no autopsy was performed, and the circumstances have been debated ever since. He was buried here at Père Lachaise on July 7th, in a quiet ceremony attended by just a handful of people. In the decades since, his grave has become a kind of pilgrimage site. A bronze plaque on the flat stone bears a Greek inscription that translates roughly as, "True to his own spirit." Over the years, the grave has been vandalized, a bust has been stolen, and so much graffiti has spread to neighboring tombs that barriers were eventually erected to protect the site. Fans still leave flowers, notes, and small mementos. Morrison remains the youngest person we will visit today, and one of only a handful of Americans in this cemetery. Let us walk west now, toward Division 11, where the crowds thin out a little and the mood changes entirely. Here we find a grave that is never without fresh flowers, a tribute to one of the supreme musical talents of the 19th century. This is the resting place of Frédéric Chopin, the Polish-born composer and pianist whose music has moved audiences for nearly 200 years. Chopin was born in 1810 near Warsaw and showed extraordinary musical gifts almost from the moment he could reach the keyboard. He composed his first piece at the age of 7 and gave his first public concert at 8. By his late teens, he had already earned a reputation across Europe as both a dazzling performer and an original composer. In 1831, he settled in Paris, and it would be his home for the rest of his life. Chopin composed almost exclusively for the piano, and in doing so, he expanded what the instrument could express. His nocturnes are among the most beautiful pieces of music ever written for any instrument. Intimate, singing, full of a melancholy that seems to come from somewhere very deep. His etudes, originally intended as technical exercises, became concert masterpieces. His polonaises carried the pride and sorrow of his occupied homeland. And his ballads essentially invented a new musical form. In Paris, Chopin became the toast of the salons. He preferred small, private gatherings to large concert halls, and his playing was said to be so delicate that listeners had to lean forward to hear every note. He also began a famous love affair with the French novelist George Sand. Her real name was Amantine Lucille Aurore Dupin, a relationship that lasted nearly a decade and produced some of his greatest work. Chopin suffered from poor health throughout his adult life, almost certainly from tuberculosis. By his late 30s, he was desperately ill. He gave his final public concert in 1848, and on October 17, 1849, he died in his Paris apartment at the age of 39. His funeral was held at the Church of the Madeleine, and Mozart's Requiem was performed at his request. He was buried here at Père Lachaise, but there is a remarkable detail. Chopin's heart was removed after death, preserved in a jar of cognac, and smuggled back to Poland by his sister. It rests today inside a pillar of the Holy Cross Church in Warsaw. His body is here in Paris, but his heart, quite literally, went home. Just a short stroll from Chopin in Division 4, we come to the grave of someone whose life was as vivid and unconventional as any novel, and who, in fact, wrote several of them. This is Colette, one of the most celebrated French writers of the 20th century, and a woman who simply refused to live by anyone else's rules. Born Sidonie Gabrielle Colette in 1873 in the Burgundy region, she arrived in Paris as a young bride. Her first husband, a music critic and hack writer who went by the pen name Willie, recognized her talent and essentially locked her in a room to write. The result was the Claudine novels, published under his name, which became sensations in Paris. When Colette discovered that Willie owned the rights to her own books, she left him, launched a career on the music hall stage, and began writing under her own name. Over the next several decades, she produced a steady stream of novels, stories, and journalism that made her one of the most prominent literary figures in France. Her novel Gigi, published in 1944, would later be adapted into the beloved musical film starring Leslie Caron and Maurice Chevalier. Colette lived with a kind of fearless vitality. She performed in vaudeville. She had open love affairs with both men and women at a time when that was genuinely scandalous, and she ran a beauty salon during the 1930s. During the German occupation of Paris in the Second World War, her third husband, a Jewish man named Maurice Gudeket, was arrested by the Gestapo. Colette used every connection she had to secure his release. By the end of her life, Colette had been elected to the Académie Goncourt, received the Légion d'honneur, and become a Grand Officer of the Order, honors almost unheard of for a woman in that era. She died in 1954 at the age of 81. France gave her a state funeral, though the Catholic Church refused her a religious ceremony on account of her divorces. She became the first woman in France to receive a state funeral. Her grave here at Père Lachaise is typically adorned with fresh flowers, as colorful as the life she led. Continuing along the winding paths, we make our way toward Division 44, where two of the biggest names in French cinema share a single grave. Here lie Yves Montand and Montand Signoret, husband and wife, and between them a combined force that dominated French film for decades. Signoret came first in fame. Born Simone Kamenke in Germany in 1921 to a French family, she adopted her mother's maiden name as a stage name during the occupation to disguise her partly Jewish heritage. She rose through the ranks of French cinema in the late 40s and 50s, becoming one of the great dramatic actresses of her generation. In 1959, she became the first French actress to win an Academy Award, taking the Best Actress prize for her role in the British film Room at the Top, playing an older woman in a doomed love affair. American audiences may also remember her from Ship of Fools in 1965, or Diabolique, the chilling 1955 thriller that reportedly frightened Alfred Hitchcock so much he went out and made Psycho. Her husband, Yves Montand, was born Ivo Levi in Italy in 1921 and came to France as a small child. He started as a music hall singer and became a major star on the French stage before Edith Piaf, whom we will visit shortly, discovered him, became his lover, and helped launch him into the stratosphere. He went on to become one of the most popular actors in France, known for thrillers, political dramas, and romantic comedies. American audiences know him best for the 1960 film Let's Make Love, in which he starred opposite Marilyn Monroe, and which sparked a real-life affair that rattled both their marriages. Montand Signoret married in 1951 and remained together despite infidelities that were open secrets in Paris. Signoret died first in 1985 from pancreatic cancer at the age of 64. Montand followed in 1991, dying of a heart attack at 70, shortly after completing the filming of IP5. They rest together here, one of the great partnerships of French cinema. Now let us cross the cemetery in a different direction entirely, heading east toward Division 89 because the next person on our tour needs no introduction, though he might appreciate a witty one. This is the tomb of Oscar Wilde, the Irish playwright, novelist, and poet whose wit still cuts and sparkles more than a century after his death. Wilde was born in Dublin in 1854 and educated at Trinity College and then Oxford, where he distinguished himself less by his exam results than by his personality. He arrived in London as a young man determined to be famous, and he succeeded almost immediately. By the 1890s, he was the most celebrated writer in England, producing a string of works that remain pillars of the English language. The novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, with its haunting premise of a man whose portrait ages while he stays forever young. The plays The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband, and Lady Windermere's Fan, comedies so sharp they still get laughs on Broadway and the West End today. Then it all came crashing down. In 1895, at the height of his fame, Wilde was convicted of gross indecency, the Victorian legal term for homosexual acts, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The experience broke his health and his spirit. After his release in 1897, he left England for France, never to return. He spent his final years in Paris, mostly in poverty, living under the assumed name Sébastien Meloth. On November 30th, 1900, he died of meningitis in a small left-bank hotel. He was just 46. Wilde was originally buried in a suburban Paris cemetery, but in 1909 his remains were transferred here to Père Lachaise, where the sculptor Jacob Epstein created the striking Art Deco monument that marks his grave, a large winged figure inspired by ancient Assyrian art. For decades, admirers covered the tomb with lipstick kisses, a tradition that became so famous it actually damaged the stone. In 2011, a glass barrier was installed to protect it, though visitors still leave lipstick marks on the glass, along with love notes and poems. It is somehow fitting that Wilde, who understood the power of a gesture better than almost anyone, would inspire a tradition that is both romantic and slightly absurd. From a man who reshaped the English language, let us turn to a man who reshaped Paris itself. A few minutes' walk through the older part of the cemetery brings us to Division 4, where you will find the grave of Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann, the man who made modern Paris look the way it does. If you have walked along the grand boulevards, admired the uniform cream-colored apartment buildings with their wrought iron balconies, or sat at a cafe on a wide, tree-lined avenue, you have Haussmann to thank, or to blame, depending on your point of view. In 1853, Emperor Napoleon III tapped Haussmann, then a career bureaucrat, to oversee the complete renovation of Paris. At the time, much of the city was still medieval, a tangle of narrow, dark streets, open sewers, and crumbling buildings. Over the next 17 years, Haussmann tore through it like a force of nature. He demolished entire neighborhoods, displaced hundreds of thousands of residents, and replaced the old Paris with the city we recognize today. Broad avenues radiating from central points, uniform building heights, public parks, modern sewers, and a water supply system. He created the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes. He oversaw the construction of the Opéra Garnier. He essentially invented the idea of urban planning as we know it. He was also hated by many. Critics called his work the destruction of old Paris. He was accused of corruption, of financial irregularities, and of serving the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Napoleon III eventually dismissed him in 1870. Haussmann spent his later years writing his memoirs and defending his legacy. He died in 1891 at the age of 81. Whether you see him as a visionary or a vandal, the Paris you see when you look out from these cemetery gates is largely his creation. From the man who built the stage, let us go to the woman who filled it with song. We are heading to Division 97 now, to a grave that draws nearly as many visitors as Jim Morrison's, and for many French people, a great deal more emotion. This is the resting place of Edith Piaf, the greatest popular singer France has ever produced, and a voice that once heard is never forgotten. She was born Edith Giovanna Gassian in 1915, and her early life reads like something out of a Dickens novel. Raised in poverty, largely abandoned by her parents, she spent part of her childhood living in her grandmother's brothel in Normandy. As a teenager, she was singing for coins on the streets of Belleville, a working-class neighborhood not far from where we stand now. In 1935, a nightclub owner named Louis Laplie discovered her singing on a sidewalk and gave her a spot in his club. He also gave her the stage name Piaf, Parisian slang for sparrow, a reference to her tiny frame. She stood barely 4 feet 8 inches tall, but when she opened her mouth, the sound that came out was enormous, raw, aching, full of a passion that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Over the next 3 decades, Piaf became the most famous singer in France and one of the most beloved entertainers in the world. Her signature songs are embedded in the culture. La Vie en Rose, which she wrote, became an international standard almost from the moment she first performed it in 1946. Non, je ne regrette rien, recorded in 1960, became her anthem, a defiant declaration from a woman whose life had given her plenty to regret. She also wrote and performed Hymne à l'amour, Milord, and Padam, Padam, among dozens of others. Her personal life was as dramatic as her music. She was married twice, had countless love affairs, including with Yves Montand, whom we just visited, and lost the great love of her life, the boxer Marcel Cerdan, when his plane crashed over the Azores in 1949. She was devastated by his death and never fully recovered. Her later years were marked by illness, addiction to morphine and alcohol, and a series of car accidents that left her in constant pain. Edith Piaf died on October 10, 1963, at the age of 47. Her friend and fellow icon Jean Cocteau died on the very same day, and it was said the news of her death was what killed him. Tens of thousands of Parisians lined the streets for her funeral procession, bringing traffic to a standstill. Her grave here is always covered with flowers and notes from admirers, a testament to a voice that still moves people who were not yet born when she sang. The contrast could not be greater as we move from the streets of Belleville to the cork-lined bedroom of one of literature's most private souls. Not far from Piaf, in Division 85, is the grave of Marcel Proust, the French novelist who wrote what many critics consider the greatest novel of the 20th century. Proust was born in 1871 into a wealthy Parisian family. His father was a prominent physician, and his mother came from a prosperous Jewish family. From childhood, Marcel was plagued by severe asthma, a condition that would shape the rhythms of his entire life. As a young man, he was a familiar figure in the fashionable salons of Paris, charming, witty, and keenly observant. But behind the socialite exterior, something monumental was taking shape. Beginning around 1909, Proust retreated into his apartment on the Boulevard Haussmann, had the walls lined with cork to block out noise, and began writing. What emerged over the next 13 years was In Search of Lost Time, known in its earlier English translation as Remembrance of Things Past, a novel in 7 volumes, totaling roughly 1.25 million words, that is essentially a vast, intricate meditation on memory, time, love, art, and the texture of experience. The most famous passage in the book involves a madeleine, a small French cake, dipped in tea, whose taste unlocks a flood of involuntary memories. That single moment has become one of the most referenced scenes in all of literature. Proust published the first volume in 1913, largely at his own expense after several publishers turned it down. By the time of the second volume, he had won the Prix Goncourt, France's top literary prize. He continued writing almost until the day he died, dictating revisions from his bed while gravely ill with pneumonia. Proust died on November 18, 1922, at the age of 51. He is buried here with his family, his legacy secure as one of the supreme artists of the modern age. From the world of letters, let us move to the world of movement. Over in Division 87, near the Columbarium, we can pay respects to a woman who revolutionized the art of dance and whose life was marked by both triumph and unspeakable tragedy. This is the memorial spot for Isadora Duncan, the American-born dancer who is widely regarded as the mother of modern dance. Duncan was born in San Francisco in 1877 and rejected classical ballet almost from the start. She found it rigid, artificial, unnatural. Instead, she developed a style of free, expressive movement inspired by Greek art, the rhythms of nature, and the music of composers like Beethoven and Wagner. She danced barefoot in flowing tunics at a time when that was considered scandalous. European audiences were captivated, and by the early 1900s she was performing to packed houses across the continent. She opened dance schools in Germany, France, and Russia, determined to create a new kind of dancer, free in body and spirit. Her personal life was tumultuous. She had 2 children out of wedlock, a son and a daughter, by different fathers. In 1913, both children were killed in a horrific accident when the car they were riding in rolled into the Seine. Duncan was shattered. She never fully recovered, though she continued to perform and teach. She lived in Paris for much of her life, and it was in Nice in 1927 that she died in one of the most bizarre accidents in history. Her long, flowing scarf became entangled in the wheel of the open car in which she was a passenger, breaking her neck. She was 50 years old. Her ashes were placed in the columbarium here at Père Lachaise. Duncan's legacy endures not in any single choreographed piece. She left behind no notated dances, but in the entire idea that dance could be personal, emotional, and free. Let us change gears entirely now and visit a composer whose most famous work is heard by millions of people every year, whether they know his name or not. In Division 68, we find the grave of Georges Bizet, the French composer who created Carmen, one of the most popular and frequently performed operas in the world. If you have ever heard the habanera, or the Toreador song, or the driving rhythms of the overture, then you know Bizet's music, even if you have never set foot in an opera house. Bizet was born in Paris in 1838 into a musical family and entered the conservatoire at the remarkable age of 9. He was a prodigious talent, a brilliant pianist, a gifted orchestrator, and a composer of tremendous melodic invention. He won the prestigious Prix de Rome at 19, which sent him to Italy for several years of study. Upon his return to Paris, he struggled to find success in the world of opera, despite his obvious gifts. His earlier works were well received by critics, but failed to connect with the broader public. Then came Carmen. The opera premiered at the Opéra Comique in Paris on March 3, 1875, and the initial reaction was not what Bizet had hoped. Many critics found it shocking, too sensual, too violent, too realistic. The story of a seductive gypsy woman and the soldier who destroys himself for love of her was a far cry from the polite drawing room operas that Parisian audiences were used to. Bizet was devastated by the mixed reviews. Exactly 3 months after the premiere, on June 3, 1875, he died of a heart attack at the age of 36. He never knew that Carmen would go on to become one of the most beloved operas ever written, performed thousands of times around the world. Tchaikovsky predicted it. He told a friend that within 10 years, Carmen would be the most popular opera in the world. He was right. It is one of the great tragedies of music that Bizet did not live to see it. From a man who died too young, let us visit a woman who refused to stop living. Nearby, in Division 44, is the grave of Sarah Bernhardt, arguably the most famous actress of the 19th century, and a woman of such outsized personality that she makes most modern celebrities look timid by comparison. Bernhardt was born in Paris in 1844, the illegitimate daughter of a Dutch courtesan. She trained at the Conservatoire and made her debut at the Comédie Française in 1862, though she was fired within a year after slapping a senior actress who had been rude to her younger sister. It was an early sign of the temperament that would define her career. Bernhardt went on to become the most acclaimed dramatic actress of her era, known internationally as the Divine Sarah. She was celebrated for the extraordinary expressiveness of her voice. Critics described it as golden, or like a silver bell, and for the intensity she brought to tragic roles. She was famous for her death scenes, which audiences found so convincing they would weep openly. She played Hamlet, Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, and the title role in the first production of Sardou's Tosca, the play that Puccini would later adapt into his opera. She made 9 tours of the United States and performed all over the world, becoming arguably the first truly international entertainment celebrity. Her personal life was no less remarkable. She kept exotic pets including an alligator and a boa constrictor. She was an accomplished sculptor and painter. She slept, according to legend, in a rosewood coffin. In 1905, she badly injured her knee on stage, and in 1915, at the age of 70, her right leg was amputated. She refused a prosthetic limb and continued to perform from a seated position or carried on a sedan chair. During the First World War, she even visited soldiers at the front. Bernhardt died in 1923 at the age of 78 from kidney failure. An enormous crowd followed her funeral procession through the streets of Paris, passing by the theater that still bore her name, all the way to Père Lachaise. Oscar Wilde, whom we visited a few moments ago, once wrote a play specifically for her, Salome, though it was banned in England and never received a London production during his lifetime. From the greatest actress of the 19th century, we turn to one of the greatest novelists, and for that we need to walk to Division 48, where a large bronze figure marks the grave of Honoré de Balzac. If you have ever taken a French literature class, you know this name. Balzac was born in Tours in 1799 and came to Paris as a young man with the burning ambition to capture the entirety of French society in fiction. What he produced over roughly 2 decades of manic, coffee-fueled writing was La Comédie Humaine, the human comedy, a vast interconnected series of more than 90 novels and stories that portray every stratum of French life, from aristocrats to criminals, bankers to peasants, artists to priests. Characters recur from novel to novel, aging, rising, falling, just as real people do. It was an astonishing achievement, one that influenced virtually every major novelist who followed, from Dickens to Dostoevsky to Proust, whom we visited just a few minutes ago. Balzac himself was a figure of enormous contradictions. He was perpetually in debt despite his enormous output, spending lavishly on fine clothes, rare antiques, and speculative business ventures that invariably failed. He wrote through the night, consuming legendary quantities of coffee. Some accounts claim as many as 50 cups a day. He was constantly pursued by creditors. In 1850, he finally married his longtime love, a wealthy Polish countess named Ewelina Hanska, after an 18-year courtship conducted largely through letters. 5 months later, he was dead, at the age of 51, from what appears to have been a combination of heart failure and the cumulative effects of years of caffeine abuse and overwork. Victor Hugo, who was among the mourners at his funeral, delivered the eulogy. Balzac's house in Paris, on the Rue Renoir, is now a museum, and his influence on the novel as an art form is essentially immeasurable. Let us shift from literature to visual art, and from a man who lived large to a man who died tragically young. Over in Division 96, we find a grave that tells one of the saddest love stories in Père Lachaise. Here lies Amedeo Modigliani, the Italian-born painter and sculptor, alongside Jeanne Hébuterne, the woman who loved him. Modigliani arrived in Paris in 1906 at the age of 21, drawn to the bohemian world of Montparnasse, where he joined a circle that included Picasso, Diego Rivera, and other young artists who were busy reinventing art. He was handsome, charming, and recklessly self-destructive. Alcohol and drugs were constant companions. His art was distinctive and immediately recognizable. Elongated faces, swan-like necks, almond-shaped eyes, figures that seemed to exist in some dreamlike space between reality and abstraction. During his lifetime, Modigliani sold very little and was often desperately poor. Recognition came too late. He developed tubercular meningitis, worsened by years of heavy drinking, and died in a charity hospital on January 24, 1920. He was 35. The day after his death, his companion Jeanne Hébuterne, who was 21 years old and 9 months pregnant with their second child, threw herself from a fifth-floor window. She could not bear to live without him. The families initially buried them separately, but in 1930, Jeanne's family relented, and she was reinterred here beside Modigliani. Today, his paintings hang in the world's great museums, and a single Modigliani portrait can sell for over $100 million. In his lifetime, he could barely pay for paint. From the heights of tragedy, let us step into a world of pure wonder. A walk over to Division 64 brings us to the grave of a man who essentially invented movie magic. This is Georges Méliès, a magician turned filmmaker who created some of the very first special effects in cinema history, and whose most famous image is one you have almost certainly seen, even if you did not know his name. Méliès was born in Paris in 1861 into a family that manufactured shoes. He was supposed to take over the family business, but the theater had other plans for him. After falling in love with stage magic in London, he returned to Paris and became a professional illusionist, eventually purchasing the famous Théâtre Robert Houdin. When the Lumière brothers demonstrated their new cinematograph in 1895, projecting moving pictures for the first time, Méliès immediately grasped what others did not. The camera was not just a recording device, it was a tool for creating illusions. Within a year, he was making films in a glass-roofed studio he built in Montreuil, just outside Paris. He pioneered stop-motion photography, double exposures, dissolves, time-lapse photography, and hand-painted color, techniques that would form the foundation of special effects for the next century. His masterpiece, A Trip to the Moon, made in 1902, features that unforgettable image of a rocket ship lodging in the eye of the man in the moon. It was the first science fiction film, the first film with a real narrative, and a worldwide sensation. Méliès produced over 500 films in all. But the film industry changed faster than he could adapt. Larger studios undercut his business, and pirated copies of his films, particularly in America, robbed him of income. By the late 1920s, the man who invented movie magic was running a candy and toy kiosk at the Montparnasse train station. He was eventually rediscovered by film historians, received the Legion d'Honneur, and spent his final years in modest comfort. D.W. Griffith said of him, "I owe him everything." Charlie Chaplin called him the alchemist of light. Martin Scorsese paid tribute to him in the 2011 film Hugo, with Ben Kingsley portraying Méliès. He died of cancer on January 21, 1938, at the age of 76, on the very same day as another French film pioneer, Émile Cohl. Shortly before his death, Méliès showed friends one of his last drawings, a champagne bottle with the cork popped and bubbling over, and told them, "Laugh, my friends, laugh with me, laugh for me, because I dream your dreams." Speaking of dreams and stories, let us go back, way back, to the 17th century, and to a man whose comedies are still performed in theaters around the world. In Division 25, we find the grave of Molière, born Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, who is to French theater what Shakespeare is to English theater. There is one caveat, however. The bones in this grave probably do not belong to Molière. When the cemetery opened in 1804 and nobody wanted to be buried here, the administrators arranged for the remains of Molière and his fellow writer La Fontaine to be transferred from their original resting places with great fanfare, hoping to attract other burials. The trouble is that both men had originally been buried in common graves, where bones were routinely mixed with those of strangers. So while the marker says Molière, the actual identity of the remains is anyone's guess. The man himself, however, needs no bones to be remembered. Molière was born in Paris in 1622, the son of a prosperous upholsterer. He was expected to follow his father into the trade, or perhaps become a lawyer. But he caught the acting bug and never recovered. He formed a theater company, spent years touring the provinces, and eventually won the patronage of Louis XIV, performing regularly at court. Molière wrote and starred in comedies that skewered the pretensions, hypocrisies, and absurdities of French society with devastating precision. Tartuffe, his masterpiece about a religious hypocrite, was so controversial that it was banned for 5 years. The Misanthrope dissected the falseness of polite society. The Imaginary Invalid mocked the medical profession. He wrote dozens more, many of which remain in the standard repertory. Here is a detail that has passed into legend. On February 17, 1673, Molière was performing in The Imaginary Invalid, a play about a hypochondriac, when he was seized by a violent coughing fit on stage. He finished the performance, was carried home, and died within hours, almost certainly of tuberculosis. He was 51. Because actors were considered disreputable by the church, he was initially denied a Christian burial, until the king intervened. The irony of a man dying while playing a character who only imagines he is sick has been noted by every biographer since. Just a few steps from Molière, in the same division, lies his old friend and fellow literary giant, Jean de La Fontaine. The two were transferred to Père Lachaise together as part of that original marketing scheme, and they remain neighbors in death as they were companions in life. La Fontaine was born in 1621 in Château Thierry in the Champagne region, and he made his name with something that sounds deceptively simple: fables, short moral tales featuring talking animals. But La Fontaine's fables are anything but simple. Written in elegant verse over several decades, they are masterpieces of wit, observation, and compressed storytelling. The tortoise and the hare, the fox and the grapes, the grasshopper and the ant. These stories, many adapted from Aesop, became cornerstones of French literature, and French schoolchildren still memorize them today. Beneath the charming animal characters, the fables are pointed commentaries on human nature, on the vanity of the powerful, the foolishness of the greedy, and the quiet wisdom of the patient. La Fontaine was a man of contradictions, a dreamer who was notoriously absent-minded, a writer who depended on the patronage of wealthy friends, and a late bloomer who did not publish his first collection of fables until he was 47. He died in Paris in 1695 at the age of 73. Like Molière's remains, the bones in La Fontaine's grave are probably not his, but the fables are his, and they endure. Now for something entirely different and entirely silent. In Division 21, we come to the grave of Marcel Marceau, the man who made the art of mime famous around the world. If you grew up watching television in the 1960s or 70s, you probably saw Marceau at some point. That pale face, the battered silk hat, the striped sailor's shirt, gliding across a stage in total silence, making you see walls that were not there, wind that was not blowing, and objects that did not exist. His most famous character, Bip the Clown, was a gentle, wide-eyed everyman who battled invisible obstacles and wrestled with the absurdities of daily life. Marceau toured the world for more than 50 years, performing for millions, and was widely credited with reviving the art of mime in the 20th century. But there is a remarkable chapter of his life that came before the stage. He was born Marcel Mangel in Strasbourg in 1923 into a Jewish family. When the Germans invaded France, the family fled south. Marcel's father was captured and killed at Auschwitz. Marcel joined the French resistance, and as a young man he used his considerable performance skills for a very different purpose. He helped smuggle Jewish children out of France to safety in Switzerland, reportedly disguising the escapes as group outings by entertaining the children and keeping them calm and quiet during dangerous border crossings. After the war, he studied dramatic art in Paris and developed the mime persona that would make him world famous. Red Skelton called him the greatest. Michael Jackson credited Marceau's movements as an inspiration for his moonwalk. Marceau continued performing well into his 80s and died in 2007 at the age of 84. One of his most famous routines was called Youth, Maturity, Old Age, and Death. The entire arc of a human life performed without a single word. From silence, let us turn to words, specifically to the words of a woman who sat at the center of one of the most extraordinary literary circles of the 20th century. In Division 94, we find the grave of Gertrude Stein, the American writer, art collector, and cultural provocateur who made Paris her home for more than 40 years. Stein was born in Pennsylvania in 1874, studied at Radcliffe and Johns Hopkins, and moved to Paris in 1903. With her brother Leo, she began collecting the works of unknown young painters, Picasso, Matisse, Cézanne, Braque, long before anyone else recognized their genius. The Saturday evening salons at her apartment on the Rue de Fleurus became legendary gathering places where the greatest artists and writers of the age came to talk, argue, and be seen. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Sherwood Anderson, Ezra Pound. They all passed through Stein's salon, and many of them owed their early encouragement to her. It was Stein who famously told Hemingway, "You are all a lost generation," a phrase he used as the epigraph to "The Sun Also Rises." As a writer, Stein was a radical experimentalist. Her work is not easy reading. It is deliberately repetitive, rhythmic, and resistant to conventional meaning. "A rose is a rose is a rose" is perhaps the most quoted line in American experimental literature. Her most accessible book is The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, published in 1933, which is not really Toklas's autobiography at all, but Stein's own memoir written in the voice of her lifelong partner. Stein and Alice B. Toklas lived together for nearly 4 decades in one of the most famous partnerships in literary history. Their relationship was essentially an open secret in an era when such things were not discussed. During the German occupation of Paris, Stein and Toklas, both Jewish, remained in the French countryside. The circumstances of their survival during those years remain a matter of some historical debate. Stein died of stomach cancer in 1946 at the age of 72. Toklas survived her by 21 years and is buried beside her. If you walk around to the back of the gravestone, you will find Toklas's name inscribed there. Staying near the back of the cemetery, in Division 90, we find the grave of another American who made Paris his home, and whose reasons for leaving the United States tell a painful story about race in America. This is the resting place of Richard Wright, the novelist and essayist whose searing portrayals of black life in America made him one of the most important writers of the 20th century. Wright was born on a plantation near Natchez, Mississippi in 1908 into poverty and hardship. His father abandoned the family when Richard was 5. His mother suffered a series of strokes that left her incapacitated. Wright educated himself largely through library books, which, as a black man in the Jim Crow South, he could only obtain by using a white friend's library card. He moved to Chicago, then New York, and in 1940 published Native Son, a novel about a young black man in Chicago whose life is destroyed by the intersecting forces of racism, poverty, and fear. The book was a sensation, the first novel by a black American author to become a Book of the Month club selection. It sold 250,000 copies in its first month. In 1945, he published Black Boy, a memoir of his childhood in the South that was equally powerful and equally successful. But even fame could not protect Wright from the daily humiliations of racism in America. In 1946, he moved to Paris, where he found a freedom he had never known. He became friends with the existentialist writers Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and he remained in France for the rest of his life. Wright continued to write prolifically, though his later works never achieved the same commercial success. He died on November 28, 1960, at the age of 52. The official cause was a heart attack, though his daughter has long maintained that his death was suspicious, pointing to the FBI's years of surveillance of Wright as a suspected subversive. His uncensored manuscripts were not published until decades after his death. Art is everywhere in this cemetery, but the next grave we visit belongs to a man whose art hangs in the Louvre. Let us walk over to Division 49, where Eugène Delacroix, the leader of the French Romantic movement in painting, is buried. If you have ever seen the painting Liberty Leading the People, the bare-breasted woman charging forward with the tricolor flag, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, then you know Delacroix's work, even if you did not know his name. That painting, completed in 1830, commemorates the July Revolution and has become one of the most iconic images in all of art. Delacroix was born in 1798, just outside Paris, and showed artistic talent from an early age. He trained in the studio of the neoclassical painter Pierre Narcisse Guérin, but quickly broke with the cool restraint of that tradition. Where the neoclassicists valued order and precision, Delacroix favored movement, emotion, and rich, vivid color. His 1824 painting The Massacre at Chios, depicting the Greek War of Independence, established him as the leading voice of Romanticism in French art. He traveled to North Africa in 1832, and the light, color, and culture he encountered there inspired some of his most vibrant work. Delacroix was also a prolific writer. His journals are considered some of the finest ever produced by a visual artist, full of sharp observations on art, color theory, and the creative process. He spent his later years completing major mural commissions for Parisian churches and public buildings, despite declining health. He died of a lung ailment in August 1863 at the age of 65. His influence on the Impressionists who followed, particularly on Renoir and Monet, who studied his use of color, was profound. Van Gogh once said that Delacroix's palette was so powerful it could make you feel the weather. We have been walking among titans, so let us pause at a grave that reminds us of how fragile fame can be. In Division 89, within the columbarium, there is a niche belonging to Maria Callas, widely regarded as the greatest opera singer of the 20th century. Except it is empty. Callas was born Maria Anna Cecilia Sophia Kalogeropoulos in New York in 1923 to Greek immigrant parents. She began her training in Athens during the war years and debuted professionally in 1941. By the 1950s, she was the undisputed queen of opera, known not only for a voice of astonishing range and expressiveness, but for a dramatic intensity that redefined what audiences expected from an operatic performance. She could go from a whisper to a thunderclap in a single phrase. Her signature roles included Tosca, Norma, Violetta in La Traviata, and Medea. Offstage, her life was tabloid fodder. Her bitter public feud with rival soprano Renata Tebaldi, her dramatic weight loss, her marriage to Italian industrialist Giovanni Battista Meneghini, and above all, her love affair with the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, who ultimately left her for Jacqueline Kennedy. That abandonment seemed to break something in Callas. Her voice, always more expressive than technically perfect, began to decline in the early 60s. She gave her last operatic performance in 1965 and spent her final years largely as a recluse in Paris. She died on September 16, 1977, of a heart attack at the age of 53. Her ashes were placed here in the Père Lachaise columbarium, but they were subsequently stolen. After they were recovered, they were scattered in the Aegean Sea off the coast of Greece at her request. The urn at Père Lachaise remains, but it is empty, a fitting metaphor perhaps for a woman whose extraordinary gifts brought her more suffering than joy. From the soaring notes of opera to the spectacle of Paris itself, let us find our way to Division 49, where rests a man who captured drama not through sound but through stone and canvas. This is the grave of Gustave Doré, one of the most prolific and imaginative illustrators who ever lived. If you have ever seen a lavishly illustrated edition of Dante's Inferno, the Bible, Milton's Paradise Lost, Cervantes's Don Quixote, or the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. The odds are good that the engravings were Dor's. Born in Strasbourg in 1832, Dor showed extraordinary drawing ability as a child and was publishing illustrations in Parisian magazines by the age of 15. Over the next 4 decades, he produced thousands of engravings and illustrations that set the visual standard for some of the most important texts in Western literature. His vision of Dante's hell, vast, shadowy, teeming with tormented souls, essentially defined how the Western world imagines the afterlife. His illustrations for the Bible are still widely used in churches and Bibles today. Dor was not just an illustrator, he was also a painter and sculptor, though his paintings were dismissed by French critics who considered illustration a lesser art. He found more appreciation in London, where a permanent gallery of his work drew enormous crowds. He was a man of enormous energy and output, producing work at a pace that exhausted everyone around him. Dor died of a heart attack in January 1883 at the age of 51. His work has influenced everyone from comic book artists to filmmakers. The dark, gothic visual language of Tim Burton's films owes a clear debt to Dor's engravings. Shall we visit one of the strangest graves in Père Lachaise? Let us make our way to Division 92, on the southeastern edge of the cemetery, where we find the tomb of Victor Noir and one of the most unusual traditions in all of Paris. Noir was a French journalist, born Yvan Salmon in 1848, who was shot and killed on January 10, 1870, by Prince Pierre Napoleon Bonaparte, a cousin of Emperor Napoleon III. The shooting occurred during a dispute over a duel challenge that had grown out of a press feud, and it set off a political firestorm. Noir was just 21 years old, and his death, a young journalist killed by a member of the imperial family, became an instant cause célèbre. More than 100,000 people attended his funeral, and the incident fueled the anti-imperial sentiment that was already building across France. Prince Pierre was acquitted by a sympathetic court, which only deepened the public's outrage. Noir was eventually buried here at Père Lachaise, and in 1891, sculptor Jules Dalou created a life-sized bronze figure depicting Noir lying on his back just as he had fallen, in his suit and top hat, at the moment of death. It is an extraordinarily realistic and detailed piece of funerary art. Now here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Over the years, a popular legend grew that touching a certain part of the bronze figure, specifically the conspicuous area below the belt, could bring fertility, enhance romantic prospects, or ensure a happy love life. The result is that one particular area of the statue has been polished to a brilliant shine by the hands of thousands upon thousands of hopeful visitors. It is one of the most photographed and most touched monuments in all of Paris, and the superstition shows no signs of fading. The cemetery authorities have periodically tried to discourage the practice, but visitors keep coming. Victor Noir was a minor journalist whose life might otherwise have been completely forgotten. Instead, thanks to an accident of sculptural realism and the persistence of urban legend, he may be the most popular resident of Père Lachaise after Jim Morrison. After that light-hearted detour, let us return to the world of high culture. In Division 11, not far from Chopin, lies a man who helped crack one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. This is the grave of Jean-François Champollion, the French scholar who deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics. For centuries, those beautiful, enigmatic symbols carved on the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt had been a closed book. No one alive could read them. Then, in 1799, Napoleon's soldiers in Egypt discovered the Rosetta Stone, a slab of black basalt inscribed with the same text in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. It took more than 20 years, and the genius of Champollion, to unlock the code. A child prodigy in languages, Champollion was fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Coptic by his teens. He became obsessed with Egypt and with the Rosetta Stone, and in September 1822, at the age of 31, he achieved his breakthrough, demonstrating that hieroglyphics were not purely symbolic, but represented a combination of phonetic sounds and ideas. The discovery opened the entire civilization of ancient Egypt to modern scholarship. Champollion traveled to Egypt in 1828, visiting the temples and tombs he had spent his life studying from afar. He returned to France in poor health and died of a stroke in 1832 at the age of just 41. The hieroglyphic system he decoded has been the foundation of Egyptology ever since. If you have ever wandered through the Egyptian galleries of a museum and read the translations beside the artifacts, Champollion is the reason you can. From the ancient world to the modern stage, let us walk over to Division 44 to visit a musician beloved by Americans and French alike. Here lies Michel Legrand, the French composer, pianist, and conductor who won 3 Academy Awards and whose music graced some of the most memorable films of the 20th century. If you have ever heard the song The Windmills of Your Mind, that spiraling, hypnotic melody with lyrics that seem to chase their own tail, round like a circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, that was Legrand. And it won the Oscar for Best Original Song for the 1968 Steve McQueen film The Thomas Crown Affair. He won his other 2 Oscars for the scores to Summer of 42 Inches in 1971 and Yentl in 1983, the Barbra Streisand film. In France, he was equally celebrated for his work with the directors of the French New Wave, composing the scores for Jacques Demy's enchanting musicals The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, a film in which every word is sung, no dialogue spoken, and The Young Girls of Rochefort. Legrand was classically trained at the Paris Conservatory but moved effortlessly between jazz, pop, and orchestral music, a versatility that was almost unheard of. He collaborated with Miles Davis, recording the album Legrand Jazz in 1958, and worked with Phil Woods, Stan Getz, and dozens of other jazz greats. He also composed for the concert hall and the theater, and released over 100 albums during his career. In total, he was nominated for 13 Academy Awards and 5 Grammys. Legrand kept working right until the end, composing and performing into his 80s with an energy that astonished those around him. He died on January 26, 2019, at the age of 86, leaving behind a body of work that spans almost every genre of music. Still in the world of music, but in a very different key, let us visit Division 13. Here rests Alain Bashung, a figure that American audiences may not know but who was, for the French, what Bob Dylan or David Bowie were for the English-speaking world, a restlessly inventive musician who reinvented himself with every album. Born Alain Bashung in Paris in 1947, he spent years as an obscure rock musician before breaking through in the early 1980s with a style that fused rock, new wave, and literary French chanson in ways nobody had heard before. His 1981 single Gabby Oh Gabby became a massive hit and made him a star. But unlike many artists who find a formula and stick to it, Bashung kept pushing into new territory: electronic music, ambient textures, darkly poetic lyrics drawn from avant-garde literature. His 1998 album Fantaisie Militaire is often cited as one of the greatest French albums ever made. He won 12 Victoires de la Musique, the French equivalent of the Grammys, more than any other artist. Bashung was diagnosed with lung cancer and died on March 14, 2009, at the age of 61. His funeral drew a large crowd to Père Lachaise, and his grave has become a gathering point for French music fans. Let us step back in time to meet a pair of medieval lovers whose story has been retold for 800 years. In Division 7 stands an elaborate Gothic canopy sheltering the tomb of Abelard and Heloise, perhaps the most famous doomed lovers in European history. Peter Abelard was a brilliant theologian and philosopher in 12th century Paris, widely considered the greatest mind of his age. Heloise was his student, a young woman of extraordinary intellect in an era when women were rarely educated at all. They fell in love. They had a child in secret. They were married in secret. When Heloise's uncle, a canon of Notre Dame, discovered the affair, he was enraged. He sent men to attack Abelard in the night, and they castrated him. Heloise was sent to a convent. Abelard became a monk. They spent the rest of their lives apart, but their correspondence, passionate, intellectual, anguished, survived and became one of the great documents of medieval love. They died decades apart. Abelard in 1142 at the age of 63, Heloise in 1164 at around 80. Their remains were moved several times over the centuries, and in 1817 they were brought to Père Lachaise as part of the same campaign that brought Molière and La Fontaine. Whether the bones actually belong to Abelard and Heloise is, like those of Molière, a matter of faith rather than forensic certainty. But the story is real, and visitors still leave letters at the tomb asking for blessings in love. From medieval romance to something altogether more enigmatic. In Division 44 lies the grave of Allan Kardec, the pen name of Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivail, and it is one of the most visited graves in the entire cemetery. A fact that surprises many first-time visitors, since Kardec is relatively unknown in the English-speaking world. The explanation lies thousands of miles away in Brazil, where Kardec's ideas have an enormous and devoted following. Kardec was born in Lyon in 1804 and worked as a teacher and educational reformer, a perfectly respectable career, before becoming interested in the phenomena of table-turning and spirit communication that swept through European parlors in the 1850s. Where others saw parlor tricks, Kardec saw the basis for a new understanding of the universe. He went on to codify what he called Spiritism, a philosophical and spiritual movement built on the idea that the spirits of the dead can communicate with the living, that the soul evolves through a series of reincarnations, and that moral progress is the purpose of existence. He published several books, the most famous being The Spirits Book in 1857, which laid out the principles of Spiritist doctrine through a series of more than 1,000 questions supposedly answered by spirits through mediums. In France, Kardec was a respected but not particularly famous intellectual figure. In Brazil, however, Spiritism took deep and lasting root after his works were translated into Portuguese. Today, millions of Brazilians identify as Spiritists, and Kardec's books remain bestsellers there. Spiritist centers across Brazil offer free medical care, education, and social services in his name. Kardec died of a stroke in 1869 at the age of 64, and his grave at Père Lachaise became a place of pilgrimage. It is said to be one of the most flower-laden graves in the cemetery on any given day, and visitors, particularly Brazilians, often place their hands on the bronze bust at the top of the monument and make a wish or say a prayer. It is one of the great surprises of Père Lachaise that a 19th-century French schoolteacher would become, for millions of people on another continent, a spiritual guide of the highest order. For our next stop, we head to Division 12, where a large and dramatic tomb honors a painter who died far too young but left behind one of the most recognizable images in Western art. This is the grave of Théodore Géricault, the father of French Romantic painting. Géricault was born in Rouen in 1791 and came to Paris as a teenager, where he trained in the studios of several established painters. He was drawn to subjects of extreme emotion and physical intensity, rearing horses, battle scenes, human suffering. In 1819, at the age of 27, he unveiled The Raft of the Medusa, a monumental painting that caused a sensation. It depicted the real-life aftermath of a French naval disaster in which survivors of the wrecked frigate Méduse were abandoned on a makeshift raft and endured 13 days of starvation, dehydration, madness, and cannibalism before being rescued. Géricault spent months researching the event, interviewing survivors, studying corpses in the morgue, and building a scale model of the raft in his studio. The resulting painting, nearly 5 meters tall and 7 meters wide, is one of the most powerful images of human extremity in all of art. It hangs in the Louvre today. Géricault never had the chance to surpass it. After the painting's exhibition, his health declined. He suffered from falls while horseback riding. He was an obsessive and reckless rider, and developed a spinal abscess. He died on January 26, 1824, at the age of 32. His tomb here at Père Lachaise features a bronze figure of the artist reclining, holding a paintbrush and palette. From a man who captured a single epic moment, let us visit a man who captured the way light falls on an ordinary afternoon. In a small family mausoleum along the Avenue des Peupliers, we find the remains of Georges Seurat, the painter who invented pointillism and who is best known for one of the most beloved paintings in any American museum. A Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, that enormous canvas of Parisians strolling, sitting, and fishing along the banks of the Seine, composed entirely of tiny dots of color, hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago, and it is one of those paintings that stops people in their tracks. Seurat was born in Paris in 1859 and trained at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was a meticulous, almost scientific painter, fascinated by color theory and the physics of light. He developed a technique he called chromoluminarism, now usually called pointillism or divisionism, in which individual dots of pure color are placed side by side and allowed to blend optically in the viewer's eye, creating a luminosity that mixed pigments cannot achieve. La Grande Jatte, completed in 1886 after 2 years of work, was his masterpiece, and it changed the direction of modern art. Seurat's career was heartbreakingly brief. He died on March 29, 1891, probably of diphtheria or meningitis, the exact cause remains uncertain, at the age of just 31. He had been working intensely on a new painting and is believed to have exhausted himself. His death was a shock to the art world, and his small body of completed work, fewer than a dozen major paintings, remains one of the most influential in modern art history. If you are a fan of the musical Sunday in the Park with George, by Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine, it was Seurat in this painting that inspired it. Let us stay in the world of painting and visit another giant. Over in Division 1, at the entrance to the older part of the cemetery, we find the grave of Camille Pissarro, the painter often called the Dean of Impressionism. Of all the Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, Degas, Cézanne, it was Pissarro who served as the group's elder statesman and guiding spirit. He was the only artist to exhibit in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions between 1874 and 1886, making him the movement's most consistent champion. Pissarro was born on the island of St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies, now the U.S., Virgin Islands, in 1830 to a family of Sephardic Jewish heritage. He came to Paris as a young man and dedicated himself to painting landscapes and rural scenes with a luminous, open-air technique that would become the hallmark of Impressionism. He was also a generous mentor to younger artists. Cézanne, who was notoriously difficult, considered Pissarro a father figure and credited him with teaching him to see. Gauguin was another of his protégés. Pissarro lived modestly and never achieved the commercial success of some of his peers. He struggled financially for much of his life, supporting a large family on the inconsistent income of an avant-garde painter. In his later years, an eye condition forced him to paint from indoors, often looking out windows at city streets. He died of blood poisoning in November 1903 at the age of 73. His legacy as the heart and conscience of Impressionism has only grown with time. We have been visiting people who lived long ago, so let us come forward in time to someone whose death shocked the world much more recently. In Division 10, there is the grave of Gaspard Ulliel, the French actor whose face was known to millions worldwide, not just from his films, but from the fragrance advertisements for Chanel's Bleu de Chanel, in which his striking, angular features became synonymous with a certain kind of French cool. Ulliel was born in the Paris suburb of Boulogne-Billancourt in 1984. He began acting as a teenager and quickly established himself as one of the brightest young talents in French cinema. His breakthrough came in 2004 with A Very Long Engagement, directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet, for which he won a César Award, the French Oscar, for Most Promising Actor. He went on to play the young Hannibal Lecter in Hannibal Rising in 2007, and starred in Xavier Dolan's It's Only the End of the World in 2016, alongside Marion Cotillard and Léa Seydoux. He had also been cast as the villain Anton Mogart in the Marvel series Moon Knight, which was still in production at the time of his death. On January 19, 2022, Ulliel was killed in a skiing accident in the Alps. He was 37 years old. His death drew an outpouring of grief across France and the international film community. He is the most recent addition to the roster of famous names at Père Lachaise. From the most recent, let us visit someone from the art world's more surreal precincts. In Division 87, in the Columbarium, we find the ashes of Max Ernst, the German-born painter and sculptor who was one of the founding figures of both the Dada and Surrealist movements. If you enjoy art that makes you question reality, dream landscapes populated by bird-like creatures, forests of impossible geometry, collages that rearrange the familiar into the uncanny, then Max Ernst is your man. He was born in Brühl, Germany, in 1891, and served in the German army during the First World War, an experience that left deep psychological scars. He became a central figure in the Cologne Dada group, and then, after moving to Paris, a leading light of André Breton's Surrealist circle. Ernst invented or popularized several important artistic techniques, including frottage, creating images by rubbing pencil over textured surfaces, and grattage, its painted equivalent. His work is endlessly inventive and often unsettling. He was married 4 times. His third wife was the art collector and patron Peggy Guggenheim. After fleeing Europe during the Second World War, he spent time in New York and later settled in Arizona before returning to France. Ernst became a French citizen in 1958, which cost him his German citizenship at the time. He died in Paris on April 1, 1976, April Fool's Day, which seems appropriate for a man who spent his life upending expectations. He was 84. While we are near the Columbarium, let us visit a man who pioneered a technology that made much of modern visual culture possible. Nearby, in Division 36, rests Félix Nadar, born Gaspard Félix Tournesson in 1820, the photographer, caricaturist, journalist, and aeronaut who was one of the towering figures of 19th-century Paris, a man who seemed to know everyone, and who captured them all on glass plates for posterity. Nadar opened his portrait studio on the Boulevard des Capucines in 1854 and quickly became the most sought-after photographer in the city. His client list reads like a roll call of the century: Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas père and fils, Sarah Bernhardt, whom we visited earlier, George Sand, Charles Baudelaire, Jules Verne, Hector Berlioz, Eugène Delacroix, Gustave Doré, and scores of other luminaries sat for Nadar's camera. His portraits were remarkable for their psychological depth. He had a gift for capturing the inner life of his subjects, coaxing out expressions of thought, humor, and vulnerability that were rare in an age when most photography was stiff and formal. But Nadar was not just a great portraitist. He was a restless innovator who pushed photography into places no one had thought to take it. In 1858, he made the first aerial photograph ever taken, shooting from a tethered balloon over the Bièvre Valley near Paris, an achievement that made him internationally famous and that Jules Verne celebrated by naming a character after him in the novel From the Earth to the Moon. Nadar went on to build a massive balloon called Le Géant, the Giant, which attracted crowds of thousands at its launches and inspired Verne to write 5 Weeks in a Balloon. He also took the first photographs ever made by artificial light, descending into the Paris catacombs and sewers with early electric lamps to document the underground world of the city. Those eerie, pioneering images of bones and tunnels are among the most remarkable photographic documents of the 19th century. Nadar was also a friend and champion of the Impressionists, and in April 1874, he lent his studio for their first exhibition, the exhibition that gave the movement its name after a hostile critic mocked Monet's painting Impression Sunrise. Without Nadar's generosity, that historic exhibition might never have taken place. He was, in short, one of those rare figures who seemed to stand at the intersection of every important development in their era. Nadar lived to the grand age of 89, dying in 1910. His portraits remain among the finest ever taken, and the innovations he pioneered, aerial photography, photography by artificial light, the use of photography as an art form rather than merely a record, laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Let us now pay a visit to a man whose work you may not have seen firsthand, but whose influence shaped the course of European art, and whose grave holds a remarkable secret. In Division 56 lies Jacques-Louis David, the great painter of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. David was born in Paris in 1748 and became the most powerful painter of his generation, the official artist of revolution and empire. His painting The Death of Marat, showing the assassinated revolutionary leader slumped in his bath with a quill still in his hand and a letter from his killer on the bath's edge, is one of the most famous political images ever created, a work of propaganda so skillful that it has been called the first modern political painting. He also painted The Coronation of Napoleon, a vast canvas depicting the moment Napoleon crowned himself emperor at Notre Dame, and The Oath of the Horatii, whose austere muscular neoclassicism became the visual language of the revolution itself. David was deeply entangled in the politics of his time. He served as a deputy in the National Convention during the Revolution, voted for the execution of Louis XVI, and used his art to glorify first the Republic and then Napoleon. He organized the great revolutionary festivals, designed the costumes and decorations, and essentially served as the regime's chief image maker, a role that would later be called propaganda minister. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, David was exiled as a regicide. He fled to Brussels, where he continued to paint but never returned to France. He died there in 1825 at the age of 77. The restored French monarchy refused to allow his body back into the country, even in death. Only his heart was returned to Paris and buried here at Père Lachaise. The rest of his remains lie in a Brussels cemetery to this day. So when you stand at David's grave, you are standing over a heart, literally, and everything else that made the man stayed forever in exile. From revolutionary politics to revolutionary ideas about thought itself. Over in Division 17, we find the grave of Auguste Comte, the French philosopher who is widely regarded as the founder of sociology. If that field of study has ever come up in your education, Comte is the man who got it started. He was born in Montpellier in 1798 and came to Paris as a young man, where he studied at the prestigious École Polytechnique. In the 1830s and 40s, he developed a grand philosophical system called positivism, which held that knowledge should be based on observable, measurable phenomena rather than on theological or metaphysical speculation. He argued that human thought progresses through three stages: the theological, the metaphysical, and finally the positive, or scientific, and that the scientific method should be applied to the study of society just as it is to the study of nature. His multi-volume work, Cours de philosophie positive, laid the intellectual groundwork for the modern social sciences. Comte was also, it must be said, an eccentric and difficult man. His personal life was turbulent, his relationships fraught, and his later writings veered into what many considered a quasi-religious direction, as he attempted to create a religion of humanity, complete with its own rituals and calendar. Comte died in 1857 at the age of 59, in relative poverty, but with a legacy that would grow enormously after his death. His ideas influenced John Stuart Mill, Emile Durkheim, and a long line of thinkers who built the discipline of sociology into what it is today. We have covered art, music, literature, science, and philosophy. Now let us meet a man of the theater whose name you may not know, but whose creation you have certainly seen. In Division 60, we find the grave of Jean de Brunhoff, the French author and illustrator who created Babar the elephant. That friendly, well-dressed elephant in his green suit has been a fixture of children's literature since 1931, when Brunhoff published The Story of Babar, a tale that began, charmingly, as a bedtime story his wife Cécile told to their two small sons. Jean, who was trained as a painter, was so captivated by the story that he decided to write it down and illustrate it in large-format watercolors that were sophisticated, witty, and full of a Parisian elegance unusual in children's books. The story follows a young elephant who flees the jungle after his mother is killed by a hunter, arrives in a city, is educated and civilized by a kind old lady, and eventually returns to become king of the elephants. The books were an immediate success. Brunhoff went on to write and illustrate 6 more Babar books, each one expanding the world of Celesteville, the Elephant Kingdom, with gentle humor and exquisite illustrations that treated children as intelligent readers deserving of beautiful art. But the man behind Babar was running out of time. Brunhoff suffered from tuberculosis, the same disease that took Chopin, whom we visited at the beginning of our walk. He spent his final years in sanatoriums in Switzerland, continuing to write and paint whenever his health allowed. He died in October 1937 at the age of just 37, leaving behind a young family and an unfinished legacy. His son Laurent, who was only 12 when his father died, eventually continued the Babar series as an adult, publishing dozens more books and overseeing the animated television adaptations that introduced Babar to generations of children around the world. It is a bittersweet legacy. A man who created one of the most beloved characters in children's literature never lived to see how far his gentle elephant would travel. Now for a name that film lovers will immediately recognize. In the columbarium, we find the resting place of Olivia de Havilland, one of the last great stars of Hollywood's golden age, and a woman who lived one of the longest and most remarkable lives in cinema history. American audiences know her best as Melanie Hamilton in Gone with the Wind, the gentle, steel-willed counterpart to Vivien Leigh's fiery Scarlett O'Hara, a performance that earned her the first of 5 Academy Award nominations. She won the Oscar twice, for To Each His Own in 1946 and The Heiress in 1949, in which she played a plain, wealthy young woman cruelly manipulated by a fortune-hunting suitor, a role that required her to suppress the natural warmth that audiences loved and play something colder and more damaged. She delivered unforgettable performances in The Snake Pit, one of the first major Hollywood films to deal seriously with mental illness, and in Hold Back the Dawn, alongside Charles Boyer. And of course, there were those 8 adventure films alongside Errol Flynn, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Captain Blood, They Died with Their Boots On, in which she and Flynn had a chemistry so natural that audiences assumed they were romantically involved. They were not, though Flynn later admitted he had been in love with her. But de Havilland's impact went beyond her performances. In 1943, frustrated by Warner Brothers' practice of extending her contract every time she turned down a role, she sued the studio, and she won. The resulting legal precedent, known informally as the de Havilland Law, limited studio contracts to 7 calendar years and fundamentally changed the power dynamic between actors and studios. It was a victory that benefited every Hollywood actor who came after her. Born in Tokyo in 1916 to British parents, her father was an English professor at the Imperial University. She moved to California as a child and began acting in her teens, cast in a local production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, that led directly to the 1935 Max Reinhardt film of the same play. From the mid-1950s on, she lived in Paris, marrying a French journalist and settling into a life that blended expatriate elegance with fierce independence. Her younger sister was the actress Joan Fontaine, and their famous rivalry, each publicly dismissive of the other for decades, is one of Hollywood's most enduring family feuds. When Fontaine won the Oscar for Suspicion in 1942, de Havilland, who had been nominated the same year, reportedly refused to congratulate her. The sisters barely spoke for the last decades of their lives. De Havilland died in her sleep at her Paris home on July 26, 2020, at the age of 104, the last surviving major star from the golden age of Hollywood. Her ashes were placed in the columbarium here at Père Lachaise, making her one of the few American film legends to rest in Paris. From the quiet elegance of a Hollywood legend, let us return to the world of the arts and visit a man whose work will bring a smile to anyone who has ever wandered through a museum. Not far from where we stand, in Division 4, lies Gustave Caillebotte, not a name that rings as loudly as Monet or Renoir, but a painter whose work deserves to be far better known, and a man whose generosity shaped the collection of Impressionist art that now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay. Caillebotte was born in Paris in 1848 into a wealthy family. His father made a fortune in the textile trade and in military contracts. Young Gustave trained as a lawyer and an engineer before turning to painting. His most famous work is Paris Street, Rainy Day, painted in 1877, a large canvas that captures a wet Parisian intersection with photographic precision and a cool, almost cinematic detachment. It hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago, alongside the Surratt we visited earlier. Caillebotte exhibited with the Impressionists, organized several of their exhibitions, and crucially, used his personal wealth to buy their paintings at a time when few collectors would. At his death, he bequeathed 67 Impressionist paintings to the French state, including major works by Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Degas, Cézanne, and Sisley. The French government initially rejected nearly half the bequest, too radical, they said, but the works that were accepted formed the nucleus of what would eventually become the Impressionist collection at the Musée d'Orsay. Caillebotte died of a stroke in 1894 at the age of 45. Without his patronage and his collection, the story of Impressionism would be very different. Speaking of people who changed the course of culture, let us stop at one of the more whimsical graves in the cemetery. In Division 89, near the boundary wall, lies a figure emerging from the stone. A bronze man, seemingly pushing his way out of his own tomb, one arm raised, a rose clutched in his hand. This is the grave of Georges Rodenbach, the Belgian poet and novelist who is best known for a single dreamlike novel, Bruges la Mort, published in 1892. The book tells the story of a widower in the city of Bruges who becomes obsessed with a woman who resembles his dead wife. It is a haunting, atmospheric work, and it was the first novel ever published with photographs as integral illustrations, images of the empty, fog-shrouded streets of Bruges that function almost like a second character. Rodenbach was born in Tournai, Belgium, in 1855 and spent most of his adult life in Paris, where he was a respected member of the symbolist literary circle. He died of appendicitis in 1898 at the age of just 43, but it is his tomb that draws visitors. That eerie figure breaking free of the grave, reaching toward the sky, is one of the most photographed monuments in Père Lachaise. Whether the rose in his hand is fresh or bronze depends on when you visit. Admirers sometimes replace it with a real one. Poetry runs deep in this cemetery. A few paths over, in Division 86, we can visit the grave of Guillaume Apollinaire, one of the most influential French poets of the early 20th century. A man who stood at the crossroads of every important artistic movement of his time, and who, incidentally, gave us a word we still use every day. Apollinaire was born Wilhelm Albert Włodzimierz Apollinari Kostrowicki in Rome in 1880 to a Polish mother of minor nobility and an absent Italian father who never acknowledged him. He settled in Paris as a young man and quickly became one of the leading voices of the avant-garde, a central figure in the artistic revolution that was transforming the city in the years before the First World War. He was a friend and champion of Picasso, writing one of the first important critical studies of the Cubist movement. He coined the word surrealism, originally in a program note for a ballet, which André Breton later adopted as the name for the movement that would dominate European art and literature for decades. His poetry shattered conventional forms. He experimented with calligrams, poems arranged on the page in the shape of their subjects, so that a poem about rain might be printed as falling drops of text. His best-known poems include Zone, a breathless tour through modern Paris that celebrates the excitement and alienation of urban life, and Le Pont Mirabeau, the Mirabeau Bridge, a melancholy meditation on lost love set beside the Seine. When the First World War broke out, Apollinaire, though not a French citizen, volunteered for the army out of a passionate love for his adopted country. In March 1916, while reading in a trench, he was struck in the temple by a piece of shrapnel. He survived, but the wound required trepanation, a surgical procedure in which a piece of the skull is removed to relieve pressure on the brain. He recovered enough to write and socialize, but his health never fully returned. On November 9, 1918, just 2 days before the armistice that ended the war, Apollinaire died during the Spanish flu pandemic, his constitution fatally weakened by his war wound. He was 38 years old. From the streets of Paris, the mourners heading to his funeral that day could hear jubilant crowds celebrating the approaching end of the war, shouting, "Abbas Guillaume! Down with Wilhelm!" referring to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. The name echoed through the air as the poet of the same name was being laid to rest. He was buried here, and his grave is located next to that of his former mistress, the painter Marie Laurencin. It is said that when Laurencin died in 1956, she asked to be buried holding one of Apollinaire's love letters and a single rose. Poetry of a different, more confessional sort brings us to Division 4, where a grave with a distinctive tree stands out among its neighbors. This is the resting place of Alfred de Musset, one of the great French Romantic poets and a man who lived and loved with the kind of feverish intensity that his poetry demanded. Musset was born in Paris in 1810 into a family with literary connections. His father was a biographer of Rousseau, and achieved fame at an astonishingly young age. By his early 20s, he was considered one of the finest poets and playwrights in France, producing works of such passionate feeling that critics placed him alongside Hugo and Lamartine in the front rank of the Romantic movement. His plays, particularly Lorenzaccio and On ne badine pas avec l'amour, No Trifling with Love, are still regularly performed on the French stage. His most famous poems draw directly from his turbulent love affairs, particularly his legendary relationship with the novelist George Sand, the same George Sand who was later Chopin's companion, making this yet another of the many connections among the residents of Père Lachaise. Musset and Sand met in 1833 and conducted a passionate, volatile affair that took them to Venice, where it collapsed spectacularly when Sand began a relationship with Musset's own doctor while Musset lay ill with fever. The affair inspired some of his best and most anguished writing, including Confession of a Child of the Century, a novel that was a barely disguised account of their love and its destruction, and the four-part poem cycle Les Nuits, The Nights, in which the poet conducts a dialogue with his muse about love, loss, and the purpose of suffering. In his later years, Musset's heavy drinking took its toll, and his creative output declined sharply. He was elected to the Académie Française in 1852, but was increasingly plagued by ill health. He died in May 1857 at the age of 46. A willow tree grows beside his grave, in keeping with his request, expressed in a poem, that a willow be planted at his tomb so that its weeping branches might love the shade. From poetry to prose, let us visit one of the literary anchors of late 19th century France. In Division 26, we find the grave of Alphonse Daudet, a novelist and short story writer whose warmth, humor, and eye for the textures of everyday life made him one of the most popular French authors of his era. American readers may know him best through Letters from My Windmill, a collection of stories set in the sun-drenched landscape of Provence that has charmed readers since the 1860s. Those stories, full of mistral winds, olive groves, eccentric village characters, and the music of the Provençal dialect, painted a picture of southern France so vivid and so affectionate that it made Daudet the literary ambassador of the region. His novel Tartarin of Tarascon, a comic adventure about a boastful small-town Provençal who sets out to hunt lions in North Africa, was a sensation and spawned 2 sequels. Tartarin, with his bombastic self-confidence and his tendency to get in over his head, became one of the great comic characters in French literature. Daudet was also a friend and companion of many of the great writers we have already visited on this tour. He was close to the Goncourt brothers, to Émile Zola, and to Marcel Proust's family. Young Marcel attended dinners at the Daudet home and modeled aspects of characters in Search of Lost Time on people he met there. In later life, Daudet suffered terribly from tertiary syphilis, which attacked his nervous system and left him in chronic, unrelenting pain. He documented his suffering with remarkable candor in a journal published posthumously as In the Land of Pain, which the writer Julian Barnes later called one of the most harrowing accounts of illness ever written. Even as his body failed him, Daudet continued to write and to receive friends at his home with the warmth and humor that defined his character. He died in 1897 at the age of 57, collapsing at the family dinner table. His son Léon would later become a prominent political figure on the less admirable side of French politics as a leader of the far right, a reminder that the children of generous men do not always follow their father's example. Now for someone whose story will resonate with anyone who remembers the fashion world of the 1980s. In Division 50, we find the grave of Patrick Kelly, the American fashion designer who took Paris by storm and broke barriers in ways that still echo today. Kelly was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1954 and grew up in the segregated South, where his grandmother, who sewed beautiful clothes from whatever fabric she could find, became his first inspiration. He was mesmerized by the fashion magazines he devoured as a teenager, and by the clothes he saw in the shop windows of the white part of town. After studying art history in Atlanta and working briefly in the fashion world in New York, he moved to Paris in 1979, arriving with almost nothing but talent and determination. Within a few years, Kelly had become the talk of the Parisian fashion world. His designs were joyful, colorful, and body-conscious. Tight-fitting dresses with bold buttons, flirtatious silhouettes, and playful nods to African-American culture. His runway shows were legendary, exuberant musical affairs with models dancing down the catwalk that broke every convention of the staid Parisian fashion establishment. Celebrities flocked to him. Grace Jones wore his clothes, and so did Bette Davis, who became a personal friend and appeared in one of his shows. In 1988, Kelly became the first American ever admitted to the Chambre syndicale du prêt-à-porter des couturiers et des créateurs de mode, the governing body of French ready-to-wear fashion. It was a remarkable achievement for any designer, let alone a black man from Mississippi who had arrived in Paris without connections or money. Kelly's success was made all the more remarkable by the racism he faced throughout his career, which he confronted not with anger, but with subversive joy. He often incorporated imagery that reclaimed and transformed racist stereotypes, using gollywog dolls and watermelon imagery in his designs as a way of seizing control of those symbols and draining them of their power. It was a bold, provocative strategy that anticipated much of the conversation about race and representation in fashion that continues today. Kelly died on New Year's Day 1990 from complications related to AIDS. He was just 35. In 2021, the Philadelphia Museum of Art mounted a major retrospective of his work, introducing his designs to a new generation. His influence on the fashion world, particularly on designers who celebrate Black identity, joy, and audacity, continues to grow. After that burst of color and energy, let us slow down for a moment. If we wander back toward Division 97, just beside the grave of Edith Piaf that we visited earlier, we find a neighbor whose music could not have been more different from hers, yet whose warmth matched her intensity. This is the grave of Henri Salvador, a beloved French singer and entertainer who brought Caribbean sunshine to the Parisian music scene for over 60 years. Salvador was born in French Guiana in 1917 and grew up in Paris. He was an immensely versatile performer, a jazz guitarist, a crooner, a comedian, and one of the first French musicians to experiment with rock and roll. His best-known songs include Syracuse, a dreamy ballad about an imaginary voyage, and Jardin d'Hiver, a gentle bossa nova-flavored track that became a hit late in his career when he staged an improbable comeback at the age of 83 with the album Chambre avec Vue. The album sold over 3 million copies and introduced Salvador to an entirely new generation. He was also known for his humor. He had a gift for comic songs and impressions, and for a gentle warmth that made him one of the most beloved entertainers in France. Salvador died in 2008 at the age of 90, resting here beside his fellow icon, Piaf. There is a curious footnote. The birth year on his grave reads 1918, but he was actually born in 1917. The error has never been corrected. Let us cross to the western portion of the cemetery now, toward Division 4, where we encounter a massive, unmistakable monument. This is the tomb of Adolphe Thiers, the first president of the Third French Republic, a man whose political career spanned nearly half a century, and who remains one of the most controversial figures in modern French history. Thiers was born in Marseille in 1797 and came to Paris as a young journalist and historian. He made his name with a multi-volume History of the French Revolution that was widely read and brought him into the orbit of political power. He served as prime minister twice under King Louis Philippe, and after the fall of the Second Empire in 1870, brought low by the disastrous Franco-Prussian War, he emerged as the leader the shattered nation turned to. In February 1871, he was elected chief executive of the new provisional government and immediately faced two crises: negotiating a humiliating peace with Bismarck's Prussia and then suppressing the Paris Commune, the radical socialist insurrection that had seized control of the city. Thiers authorized the military assault that crushed the Commune during the Bloody Week of May 1871. If you walk to the northeastern corner of this cemetery, you will find the Mur des Fédérés, the Communards' wall, where 147 of the last surviving Communards were lined up and shot by firing squad on May 28th. They were buried in common graves at the foot of the wall. That wall remains a place of pilgrimage for the French left, who marched there every year to lay wreaths. It was Thiers who gave the order. The decision made him a hero to the conservative establishment and a villain to generations of French socialists and trade unionists who have never forgiven him. In August 1871, the National Assembly formally named him President of the Republic, making him the first leader of what would become one of the longest-lasting democratic governments in French history. He served as president until 1873, when he was forced out by monarchists in the Assembly who distrusted his growing republicanism. Thiers spent his final years as an elder statesman and died in 1877 at the age of 80. His presence here is a reminder that Père Lachaise holds not just artists and dreamers, but also the hard men of power whose decisions shape the lives of millions. Let us lighten things up with a story about one of the earliest international sensations of the Romantic era. In Division 39, there stands an imposing memorial to Gioachino Rossini, the Italian composer whose operas made him the most famous musician in Europe by the time he was 30. Now, a clarification. Rossini's body is no longer here. It was moved to the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence in 1887, nearly 20 years after his death. But the monument remains as a tribute to the decades he spent in Paris and the extraordinary mark he left on the city's musical life. Rossini was born in Pissarro, Italy, in 1792 and showed such precocious musical talent that he was composing operas by his teens. He wrote The Barber of Seville in 1816 in what is said to have been just 2 or 3 weeks, and despite a disastrous opening night in Rome, the audience booed and hissed. It quickly became one of the most popular operas ever written. It remains a staple of the international repertoire to this day. Rossini went on to produce a string of successes, including Cinderella, The Italian Girl in Algiers, and Semiramide, all before moving to Paris, where the opera commissioned him to write new works. The last and grandest of these was William Tell, completed in 1829, whose overture, with its galloping finale, became so famous it would later serve as the theme for the Lone Ranger radio and television shows. And then, remarkably, Rossini simply stopped. He was 37 years old, at the absolute peak of his fame, and he never wrote another opera. The reasons have been debated for nearly 2 centuries. Was it depression? Was it laziness? Was it a shrewd recognition that musical tastes were changing, and that he had said all he had to say? Nobody knows for certain. Rossini lived for nearly 40 more years, much of them in Paris, where he became as famous for his dinner parties as for his music. He was a legendary gourmand, and he gave his name to Tournedos Rossini, a dish of beef topped with foie gras and truffles that remains on menus today. His Saturday evening gatherings in his Paris apartment attracted the cream of European culture. He died in Paris on November 13, 1868, at the age of 76, from complications following surgery. His funeral at the Church of the Trinity drew thousands. His remains were eventually returned to his beloved Italy, But his monument here still stands as a reminder of the years when Rossini was the undisputed king of opera. We are nearing the end of our walk, and I want to make sure we visit a few more remarkable residents before we say goodbye. In Division 33, we find the grave of Louis Visconti, the architect who designed two of the most recognizable monuments in Paris. He was the man responsible for Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides, that massive red porphyry sarcophagus set into the floor of the gilded dome church, surrounded by 12 columns representing Napoleon's greatest victories. The whole ensemble so grand, it makes even skeptics of Bonaparte pause in awe. Visconti also designed the fountain at the Place Saint-Sulpice, one of the most beautiful in Paris, and oversaw major expansions of the Louvre under Napoleon III, connecting the old palace to the Tuileries and creating much of the monumental facade visitors see today. Born in Rome in 1791 to an Italian family that included scholars and antiquarians, Visconti came to Paris as a child and trained at the École des Beaux-Arts. He became one of the leading architects of the July Monarchy and the Second Empire, known for a grand classical style that perfectly suited the ambitions of his royal and imperial patrons. When Napoleon's remains were brought back from St. Helena in 1840, it was Visconti who won the competition to design the tomb, beating out dozens of other architects for the honor. The project consumed him for years. Visconti died of a stroke in 1853 at the age of 62. Before his work on the Louvre was complete, it was finished by his successor, Hector Lafeuille. If you visited Napoleon's tomb before coming here, you stood inside Visconti's creation, and when you walk through the Louvre's courtyard, you are walking through his vision of what a palace should be. For our next to last stop, let us visit a poet whose most famous work became an anthem of freedom. Over in Division 50, we find the grave of Paul Éluard, one of the great French poets of the 20th century, and a key figure in the Surrealist movement. Éluard was born Eugène-Émile Paul Grindel in Saint-Denis in 1895, the son of a seamstress and a bookkeeper. As a teenager, he contracted tuberculosis and spent 2 years recovering in a Swiss sanatorium, where he began writing poetry, and where he met a young Russian woman named Helena Diakonova, known as Gala, who would become his first wife and the great passion of his youth. After the First World War, Éluard joined André Breton's Surrealist circle in the 1920s, writing poetry that combined dreamlike imagery with a deep emotional clarity that set it apart from the more obscure experiments of some of his peers. Where other Surrealists aimed to confuse, Éluard aimed to move. His most famous poem, Liberté, written in 1942 during the darkest days of the German occupation, was initially published clandestinely in occupied France and then dropped by British Royal Air Force planes over the country as a morale-boosting leaflet. Each stanza catalogues the places where the poet inscribes a single word, on his school notebooks, on the sand and the snow, on the golden bread of mornings, and each stanza ends with the same declaration. The word is liberty. The poem became an anthem of the French Resistance and remains one of the most beloved and frequently recited poems in the French language. It is taught in every school in France. Éluard's romantic life was characteristically surrealist in its complications. Gala left him for the painter Salvador Dali, a betrayal that haunted Éluard for years, though the three maintained a peculiar and uneasy friendship for some time after. He found love again with Maria Benz, known as Nush, a former circus performer and model, and her sudden death from a stroke in 1946 devastated him. He eventually married Dominique Laure, who cared for him in his final years. After the war, Éluard became an active member of the French Communist Party and traveled widely as a spokesman for peace, though his political associations drew criticism from some former friends and allies. He died of a heart attack on November 18, 1952, at the age of 56. His funeral drew a vast crowd, and the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda delivered the eulogy. His poetry, at once intimate and universal, personal and political, continues to be read and recited across France and far beyond its borders. And so we come to our final stop, and for it, let us circle back toward the heart of the cemetery, to Division 28, where there is a name that most visitors walk right past, and should not. Here lies Beaumarchais, Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the playwright, watchmaker, spy, arms dealer, and provocateur whose two comedies, The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro, changed the course of European culture. If those titles sound familiar from the opera world, it is because Rossini, whose monument we visited a few minutes ago, adapted the first, and Mozart adapted the second. But Beaumarchais' originals were revolutionary in their own right, and in more ways than one. The Marriage of Figaro, written in 1778, was a daring social satire in which a clever servant outwits his aristocratic master, exposing the Count's hypocrisy and asserting the dignity of ordinary people. Louis XVI tried to ban it, recognizing that the play's central argument, that a man's worth should come from his talent and character, not his birth, was a direct challenge to the foundations of aristocratic society. The play was eventually performed in 1784 and became an enormous sensation. Napoleon later called it the revolution already in action. But Beaumarchais was not just a writer. He was one of the most colorful and improbable figures of his era, a man who seemed to live several lives at once. He started as a watchmaker, inventing a new type of escapement mechanism for clocks that earned him the attention of the French court. He became a music teacher to the daughters of Louis XV. He married well, inherited wealth, and used it to enter the world of business and intrigue. He was a secret agent for the French crown, conducting covert diplomatic missions across Europe. And during the American Revolution, Beaumarchais played a role that every American ought to know about. He organized secret shipments of arms, ammunition, and supplies to the American rebels, funneling the aid through a fictitious trading company called Rodrigue Hortalez and Company. This French support was crucial to the American cause at a critical moment in the war, before the formal alliance between France and the United States was signed. Without Beaumarchais' guns and gunpowder, the outcome at Saratoga, the turning point of the revolution, might have been very different. After the French Revolution, Beaumarchais' own life became more turbulent. He was briefly imprisoned during the Terror, went into exile in Hamburg, lost much of his fortune, and returned to Paris only in his final years. He died in his sleep on May 18, 1799, at the age of 67, reportedly with a peaceful expression on his face. His original burial was in a garden near the Bastille, but his remains were later transferred here to Père Lachaise. He is one of those figures who resists any single label: playwright, inventor, spy, revolutionary, patriot, rogue, and whose life, like the cemetery that holds him, contains multitudes. We started our walk at the grave of a young American rock star who came to Paris and never left. We end at the grave of a French playwright whose comedies helped inspire two revolutions, one in France and one in America. In between, we have visited composers who changed the way we hear music, and novelists who changed the way we read stories. We met painters who saw the world differently, and scientists who decoded its secrets. We stood before the graves of a tiny singer with a voice like thunder and a towering actress who performed with one leg. We visited a mime who saved children from the Nazis and a watchmaker who armed the American revolutionaries. We met people who lived to 104 and people who never saw 30. We stood beside lovers separated by 8 centuries and a husband and wife who shared a single tomb. Père Lachaise holds more than 1 million souls within its ancient walls. We visited 50 of them today. But in those 50 lives, in the music they composed, the books they wrote, the paintings they left behind, the buildings they raised, and the barriers they broke, you can trace the full sweep of human ambition, creativity, and courage. And every one of these people, no matter how famous, no matter how brilliant, ended up in the same place, beneath the chestnut trees and cobblestones of a Paris hillside, neighbors for all time. The gates of Père Lachaise will close soon, and the cemetery will settle into its evening quiet. The foxes will emerge from their hiding places among the tombs. The owls will begin their rounds, and the dead will keep their silent company as they have for more than 2 centuries. Thank you for walking with us today. It has been our pleasure to be your guide.